pretty sure I set it to the right channel already. Yes, I did. Okay, very good. All right. So a given camera device may provide support at one of two levels, limited or full. If a device only supports the limited level, then it exposes a feature set that is roughly equivalent to the older camera API. Okay, so that's open. I'm just looking through the public methods of what you can do. You can capture session, list service outputs. Okay, so looks like, you know, this is a series of services, and each service I'm suspecting is an image. I could be wrong, but you know, that seems to be what it's implying. Okay, create, reprocess, capture request. Capture request for new reprocess capture request from a total capture result. So it looks like you can get the feed from the camera. So that's one. And then we also want to look up microphone, no results. Audio record. Okay, so we want to look up audio instead. Come on. Audio. There we go. Okay, so with audio, you have all kinds of stuff here. Audio device, audio manager. So I would start with audio manager and see what it can do over there. Probably not media store, which is basically hooking up you to Google Play Music, and then there's also a audio device callback as a class all by itself. So I think this one and
audio manager is the volume and ringer mode.
Okay, so that's not the. There's also device info, which is only reporting the information. But it might give you a link to how to access the audio stream, because what you need is actually the audio stream itself and be able to buffer up to 20 seconds up to the point where you click the camera. So these are the things that you can look into.
Yeah, and then to reset it.
And then to
I gotta loop it.
Well, it has to be a running buffer, so you
Yeah,
have to basically, yep.
I can't just cheat and say, save a file for me starting now for 10 seconds.
So now it depends on whether it can generate events or whether it can be automatic, because if it can be fully automatic, where you can just set up a buffer and hook it up to a audio channel, and the audio channel has its own sampling frequency, right? So if it has an internal mechanism and say attach this running buffer to this audio channel, and the depth of the buffer is based on how many samples, and that determines how much time is being recorded, right? So if it can kind of self-manage that, then you don't have to do any work. And I'm suspecting it is actually capable of doing it, because it just seems to make sense that it can maintain a buffer to record something. And whether it can be a limited buffer with only a certain number of frames, that's up to, that may be a question there.
Doable.
Yeah, I think it's doable. All right, so, okay, so you guys are more than welcome to bring up things that you want to do with your project, and I can kind of look into, because I'm new to, Android as much as you are, especially when it comes to these kind of deeper, topics, but I can look into it. And kind of give you a pointer of where to look, and if I have time, I can make a sample program to illustrate, okay, this is the basics of how to use it, so that you guys have a framework that you can build on. Is that okay? Yeah. All right, so, but today's main, yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna throw out,
yep.
I'm curious about storing, like saving a file to the phone itself, not to some sort of cloud thing, but just writing.
I think that's a Java issue, not even an Android issue. So if you look up, how to write files in Java, how to read and write files in Java, that should answer your question. But I did a research on something. Depending on how much stuff you're storing, if you only try to store like configuration data and stuff like that, today's topic is going to be very relevant, because we are basically re-implementing TinyDB, but in Java. So maybe that might be helpful for your purposes. Okay. Yep.
Do you have the recorder on?
Yes, I do. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started with that one. But before we start the actual Android program, the first thing I want to show to you guys is Sqlite, okay, which has its own page, homepage, and also has its own Wikipedia entry as well. So I was reading both of those. So depending on how much you are a SQL guru, okay, if you already know SQL well enough, then you might want to go to Sqlite, go to their documentation, and then go to programming interfaces, and it will give you, a pretty good detail of the SQL syntax of this particular SQL quote-unquote engine. It is not a server, okay? That's the main difference between SQLite as opposed to all the other SQL implementations like MySQL, PostgreSQL, Microsoft SQL, Oracle. Those are all server-based. This is not server-based, so this is very lightweight. It's very easy to use from the perspective of the application, but it also comes with limitations. Okay, so we'll talk about some of those when we go to the Wikipedia page.
When you mean it's not server-based, you mean it executes in our
It's
space?
a library.
So it executes in our codes, in our process
Yes.
space.
Everything is done in your process. It can handle multiple threads. The library, actually can handle multiple threads, but of all the threads, only one can be writing. Up to one can be writing, but you can simultaneously read from multiple threads. So it has limitations as opposed to a server-based, approach where you can open up as many connections as you want, and they can all want to go carry out operations at the same time. But this is really interesting in many ways. So for those of you who are already SQL, you're experienced with SQL commands, you can start with this one. Okay, it's just a reference manual on the syntax of the SQL as implemented by Sqlite. Sqlite is based on the syntax, is based on PostgreSQL, which by itself is also open source. Okay, if you're new to SQL, none of this really matters. Okay, but the Android library supports classes where you don't even need to understand a lot about SQL itself. You can just use class methods for the most part to access a database. So that would include, yeah, go ahead.
Is the database seen on the phone or can it be remote?
The database is on your phone, not remote.
Okay.
Now, if you want the remote capability, then you want to read the notes from Monday. Because on Monday we talked about general socket, from the client side. And MySQL, along with Oracle and all the other server-based databases, they have a port number, and then you have to use a socket to connect to the port number of the database. And if I remember correctly, MySQL has a port number of 3306. So you can open a direct connection to it, but you may not want to make that port open unless it is going through SSL, because if it is plain text, then you're exposing a lot of stuff to the internet. But the lecture on Monday is all about just general network socket connection. So that will basically give you an idea of how to open a socket to your MySQL server that is sitting anywhere on the internet. Now for testing purposes, if you don't want to expose anything, you can always run a MySQL server that is local to your home Wi-Fi network. So that way, if people, it can still be hacked, but it has to be, someone has to get into your Wi-Fi network first. Okay, so getting back to SQL, SQLite itself. My first impression of SQLite was, oh, okay, this is SQLite. Okay, so it's not relational. Well, I could not be more wrong. This is actually relational because that's the first thing it says. It's a relational database management system. Okay, but the thing is, the entire database is stored in one single file. Okay, there's a file called something with a .db extension, and that includes everything. And the other interesting part was, I was expecting this to only be able to handle up to some hundreds, at the most hundreds of megabytes of data of the entire database, and that would be it, okay? Because it's a one file approach. When you read through this, it can actually handle up to 147 terabytes. But that's as a single file, okay? It only needs a single file on the host in order to maintain the entire database. And you can create tables just like with any type of database engine. You can make most of the queries like most of the database engines. So it's really interesting. If you read the history of Sqlite, you will actually start to understand why it is so cool. So I'll go kind of scroll down to the history here. So this was invented or created by Richard Hipp for General Dynamics on contract with the U.S. Navy. And this software, he was designing software used aboard guided missile destroyers, which originally used XPUX, which is a variant of Unix, with an IBM Informix database backend. Sqlite began as a TCL extension. So this is supposed to be hardened, super reliable, lightweight, and efficient because of the way it was supposed to be deployed. I mean, this is supposed to be deployed on a guided missile destroyer. And of course, I'm not quite sure which one. I have a suspicion since this is 2000, this may not be the Zumwalt class destroyer. Do you guys know about the Zumwalt class of destroyers?
No.
No? Okay, so that's another thing that it's kind of interesting. Zumwalt. I could be. Oh, I actually got the spelling right. Cool. Does that look like a destroyer to you?
Luxury yacht.
It is a destroyer. It is actually.
It's like a stealth destroyer.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's angled to deflecting a radio wave. But the most interesting part about this destroyer is it is actually an armored data center with big guns. Unlike the other destroyers, which are not computer center based, this one is entirely computer center based. Which basically means the terminals, they are all interchangeable. You just have to sign in, and there's your station. So if you're the navigator, okay, you can sign on to any workstation to bring up the navigator screen. So you don't have a designated post, on the bridge or anywhere in the ship. So it's a very interesting design. It has a huge generator for a small ship. In other words, it can generate a huge amount of electrical power to basically as a test platform for energy-based weapons. So railguns, lasers, and stuff like that. It was designed to test those energy weapons. It has a conventional weapon as well, but that's not the main thing about this destroyer. So read about this. It's really kind of interesting. It uses Linux. In commission 2016, so it may not be this one when in the other page in the so on the other page when it mentioned a cruise missile destroyer, it may not be this one because this one is a whole lot newer, 16 years after 2000. And also there are only 2 completed when 32 were planned and 29 were canceled. But it was mostly conceived as a test platform more than anything else. Interesting design and definitely expensive as well. $22 billion for the entire program and $3.964 billion per unit. So it's pretty expensive.
Down near the bottom there, it says a long, for displacement, it says a long ton.
I think that's a unit.
It's almost the exact same as a ton, it looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's not particularly big as a destroyer. It's still the smallest, one of the smallest warship, because destroyers are basically at the bottom of the list when it comes to size. But it's a high-tech platform. That's the whole purpose of this thing. It's designed to test stuff. And you can look it up with Linux as well. So it is supposed to be powered by Linux. Particular distributions or hardened versions of Linux. So it's very interesting. The other part that's interesting about this one is the name Zumwalt is actually after the last name of a naval admiral, but the first name of the admiral is Elmo. Same as the Sesame Street character Elmo. Elmo Zumwalt. And then the first captain, I'm not sure whether they have changed captain, but the captain is Kirk. But it's James something Kirk. It's really coincidental.
James T.
It's not James T.
Tiberius.
Okay, let me see. Let me see if I can find that. Captain. No, it doesn't say the captain. But we can look it up here. Captain James something. Okay, there we go. Because I remember all of these coincidental names, so that kind of makes it interesting. Captain James Kirk, just not T. Very coincidental. Just it's hard to forget about this ship because of all the interesting aspects.
Sure that's not fake news? I read on the internet, you can't believe everything you read on the internet.
I suppose not.
I've been confused ever since.
It's okay. If you can do it in Android, it's real. That's the only reality that we have. Okay, so getting back to Sqlite, okay, very interesting origin because the whole thing started off not as some graduate student's pet project in a university, but it is actually started its life as a pretty important and critical part of a war machine. Okay, so the design goal were to allow the program to operate without installing a database management system or requiring a database administrator. So HIP borrowed the syntax from PostgreSQL 6.5. And since then, he has been updating, and changing the syntax to keep it updated. So it implements most of SQL 92, which is a standard for SQL, but it lacks some features, such as some of the trigger features are missing. It has an unusual type system where the types are not associated with the columns, but with each individual data item. So it has very late type binding compared to most SQL implementations. So when you create a column, you don't say this column is text, this column is an integer, this column is a date, this column is da-da-da. You just say, I need these columns with these names. So when you store something to it, then it will automatically look at what you're trying to store and then try its best to find the right type to store the data.
So that means when you make the SQL call, you get the data back, you can't assume what the data type is, right?
That is correct. Yep.
So you may have to load it to a string or something, or an object of some sort.
Correct. Yep. So it's interesting. It's not like most database engines. It has what we call late type binding. So to enforce types, you have to add extra constraints and stuff like that. Several threads may access the same database concurrently, but only one can be writing. So that's a big restriction of this particular database.
But it's different than like the UI thread because any one of the threads can write.
Correct.
But only one at a time.
But only one at a time. That is correct. So it's very interesting. It is open sourced. Anyone can use this. So when you look at notable users, this is actually quite interesting. ODBC driver has developed and has a driver for this, and it is used in LibreOffice. Most browsers actually at some point in time use as SQLite, although the new ones is supposed to use IndexedDB instead of SQLite. And web application framework, we can see Drupal. And then on the operating system part, this is the most interesting part. You can see Android. Okay, well, we are not surprised because there's an entire class in the Android packages to deal with SQLite access. But you can also see it is used in all the BSD distributions, Mac OS 10, iOS, Windows 10, and BlackBerry. Okay, so BlackBerry 10 actually had it too. Symbian OS, when it was around, also had it. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, it found its way into most of the operating system, lightweight or otherwise. Any questions about this part? No questions? Okay. So when we do use SQLite in Android, we can basically rest assured that this is not some toy SQL engine that will not be able to handle big data sets or is not efficient. This is pretty much proven technology at this point. Okay. Any questions about this? Any comments? How many people have some exposure to SQL queries from the past? Okay, so we have some people with some background with SQL. You can execute SQL statements. Just type the statement and execute those statements. But it also gives you a non-SQL statement-based interface. So for people who are not familiar with SQL, it can actually do most of the work without actual SQL queries. So it's actually pretty flexible from that perspective as well. All right. So what we'll do today is I have a sample program written, and the purpose of the sample program is two-folded. One, you can see all the tabs that I open in order to get things done.
Very organized.
Well, that's the need. Okay, so here's db1.zip, which is on the shared folder. You guys can download it and open it up on your own computer if you want to. It's not required. So I'll go ahead and do this. Okay, so we'll go ahead and download db1. It's a fairly small program, especially comparing this to the socket program, which is a little bit bigger. So we'll go ahead and, let's see if it's download. Right click. Okay, download is, I thought it's grayed out, it's just faded because it's at the bottom. Okay, so we'll go ahead and download. We'll unzip it. Okay, and then we'll open it in Android Studio. Apparently Android Studio had no updates this time. So there we have it. Oh, okay, here's the update. I was hoping that there's no update today, but nope, there's one. Small enough, I can just go ahead and update it.
This time they updated the emulator.
Which can be important because there might be something wrong with the emulator image itself that causes some of the problems.
They said there's all kinds of things wrong with the emulator.
But then the question is, did they make it better or worse? There's always that chance that it wasn't fixed. They just made it worse. Okay, so let's go to the project, db1, and import build.gradle. And on the road, I'm seeing more Lyft cars than Uber cars. So I think there's definitely a trend, for people are switching from Uber to Lyft. One of the bigger problems, with drivers was Uber is charging too much. So Uber is losing customers to Lyft, but the drivers, are the ones in trouble because they don't have people riding with them anymore. Yep.
What's Lyft?
Lyft is a competitor of Uber when it comes to having a centralized organization to coordinate people who are offering rides and people who need rides.
Same concept.
And you've seen the little circled U, where it's kind of like the U Uber. Well, they have a little pink lift on the back. A lot of them drive for both.
Yeah.
Yeah, they just drive for both, so they're always scouting for rides, and it shows up on their thing.
But it's the same concept.
Same concept.
Exactly the same.
But Lyft is less expensive That's what people are complaining. That's why Uber drivers are complaining. It's like, you cannot make it too expensive. This is killing me.
Used to be taxis. It used to be taxis.
They still have taxis.
That's kind of like the old long distance. You used to have to pay.
Well, the cost of taxi is higher, and that's the reason why people are going for Lyft and Uber. It's because taxis are more expensive. I know a mechanic who is still fixing all the Prius or the Prii, rule of the yellow cabs, and it's interesting. They actually drive these things to the ground, literally. They drive the Prii to the ground, and then they go for engine swaps. And apparently that is still more money saving compared to driving like the older Crown Victorias and whatnot. Yeah, my mechanic can do with one person, only assigning one person on the job, and this is a relatively new apprentice, they can do one engine swap per day on a Prius. That's actually not bad. I mean, if you think about it, there's a lot of stuff that has to come out first, all the harness and whatnot, and then you have to lift the engine, put the new one in, put all the harnesses back, and then you have to reprogram the thing too, because a lot of the configuration needs to be reprogrammed. So they can do it in one day with only one person on the job. If they put like 2 or 3 people on the job, it can be done in a few hours. All right, so getting back to database. So the first thing you need to do, or you don't need to do this, but it really helps, is to derive a subclass of Sqlite open helper, okay, which is a very weird name. Sqlite, okay, we know what that is, but it is an open helper, which means this class or objects of this class are specifically designed to help you open up a Sqlite database. Okay, so the way I do this is I put some of these things here. So there's a database version, and you want to kind of keep track of the database version, like what is the current version. And it is actually required. Okay, this particular member is required. The database name is not required, but I put it here anyway, just so that I can associate the name of the file associated with this database as a part of this class. And the name of the only table that I have is also not required, but I put it here just as well. Yep, go ahead.
What's final?
Final means I don't think it's exactly the same as const.
You can't derive from it anymore, or something like that.
You cannot derive from it, but this is not a class. So if you add final to a class, that means you cannot derive from a subclass. But this is applied to a particular property or member of a class. Static means it is associated with a class and not an object. And then final.
That means it's a constant, cannot be changed.
Okay, so it is constant. Thank you. Okay, cool. All right. So the first one is the first method. It's not exactly a method, but it's the constructor. So the constructor doesn't do much except it will use the past context. The context is what is it includes everything that we know about the application itself. So this is the context. And it uses that to call the constructor of the superclass, which is Sqlite open helper. And I just passed the name of the file that is representing the database. The null is the third argument. I cannot remember what it was, but a null means we do not need that. And then the database version is the last one. Now the database version is actually important because when you change the schema of your database, you have to change the database version, because there are 3 methods that you have to implement in this case. The first method that you have to override, I should say override, not implement, because you're deriving a subclass out of a superclass. So the first method that you have to override is onCreate. So onCreate is called when the database is just created. In other words, the file, in this case kv.db, did not exist before. So when you first create the database, when you first create the file that is representing the database, this method is going to be called. So what you want to do with this call is you want to create all the tables that you need in order for the database to be useful. Is that okay? So just like with most database management, okay, when you start off with an empty database server and you want it to serve a particular purpose, you have to create all the tables first. Okay, if you have constraints, you have to write all the constraints here as well. So this is the place where you set up the schema of the entire database. And then another call that you have to implement is on upgrade. On upgrade is basically saying, okay, you are changing the way you do your database implementation. You're adding a new table, okay? Or with known existing tables, you have added new columns, or you have added constraints. So what you need to do is to implement this particular, or override this particular method so that you look up, you basically have to figure out how to upgrade from any old version to any new version. So when the app runs and it finds out that, oh, we have a database already, but it is of version 2, but the current version, which is coming from database underscore version, is version 5, then your old version, when this method is called, your old version is going to be the old version, what did I say, 2, 3? And then the new version is going to be 5. So your code has to figure out the differences between those two and do all the surgeries that are necessary to bring the tables, the constraints, and whatnot up to date. Yep?
All three of these methods were required?
The constructor is not required. If you do not supply, no, I take it back. The constructor is required because you need something to actually hook up to the database. These two are required as well, but there are other things you can also override. One is on downgrade. You can actually downgrade the database to. So if you want to provide a path to downgrade the database to an earlier version, then you want to implement that as well. Question? I thought there was a hand. No. Okay. And with Android Studio, it's actually pretty easy to find out what can be overwritten. So when you say just on, you can see on configure, on downgrade, on open, and so some of these, unless it is already final, you can override these. Okay. All right. So the way I implement it is just very simple. I'm creating a table. Okay. If not exists. This part is not necessary because this on create is not going to be called unless there's no database already existing. So by the time this is called, we know for sure that no table is there already at this point. But it doesn't hurt, okay? If not exists, it never hurts. And then I use concatenation to concatenate with the name of the table, which is KV. And then I specify the two columns that I need for this particular database. K is one column, V is another column. I do not specify here what is the index into this database or what is the key into this database. If you want something to be a primary key, Sqlite can only support using integers as a primary key. You cannot use text as a primary key. So I'm not even going to bother with a primary key based on K here. Question?
Are the comments auto-generated comments, or did you add all
Oh, I added all those.
Oh, okay.
So for instructional purposes, I added all those.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. So this is the open helper. So with the open helper implemented, I now can kind of use that and you implement TinyDB, which is something that is mirroring TinyDB from Android, from App Inventor. Okay, so TinyDB is a class, but everything is static. Okay, so one way you want to make sure that a class is completely static, that somebody cannot create an object out of it, is to hide its constructor. So once you say that the constructor is private, and in this case, I should have just made the parameter, null with no parameters. But it doesn't even matter because, when you hide the constructor, then no code can create an object out of this class because the constructor itself is not available. Does it make sense?
So you're creating an object.
are you creating an object within the class there, or what is that? Or is that just a definition?
Everything is basically static with this class. You cannot create objects out of it.
You should use the method.
So what? So that private tinydb context is just a declaration for a constructor. Is that what that is?
Yes.
Okay.
But because the constructor is private, you cannot use it from outside of the class, which basically ends up hiding the constructor.
Okay.
So that people cannot create objects out of it because the object is not useful.
Is
Yeah?
it used similarly to the MVA setup? Or?
Yes. So MVA setup is a class, quote unquote class, but it's a completely static kind of class where all the members are static.
And it's used. So MVA setup is used to create the object,
Right.
The adapter object, right?
Exactly, and you do so. That's why you do not need to have an object of the MVA setup class. So in this case, I'm making the assumption that each app only needs one single tinydb, which was the case in App Inventor. So I'm trying to mirror what we do with App Inventor over here. Okay, I do have one method, public method called close, so that we can actually call the close method of the class itself when everything is done. And then we have lookup, we have store, and then we have delete. So those are the only three methods that I'm currently supporting. I do not have a way to return all the keys just yet, okay? But we can do that. So which one do you want to go for first? To explain first, lookup, store, or delete?
It makes sense to store something first.
Okay, let's go ahead and store something first. Okay, so when you're storing something, you need to provide two things. K is the key, and V is the value. So we are still using the same key value pair concept that we introduced in App Inventor, except in this case we're not dealing with lists anymore. Okay, so we're just specifying the two strings. One is the key, one is the value. The key itself, can be any string. It doesn't have to be, something that resembles an identifier in C or C++ or Java. It can contain space, can contain quotes, can contain all the special symbols, because it is nothing more than just a string. Same thing goes with the value. So the first thing I check is whether DB is null or not, okay, because you don't want to access DB when it is null. It is kind of a moot point, okay, it does chew up some processing time, but for the most part, people really should make sure that the database is opened correctly before they try to access it. So the main code is here. So it does call lookup because I want to see if something is already associated with that particular key. Unlike in tinydb where you can just say, let's just overwrite. If it's not there, we'll create it. Otherwise, we'll just overwrite it. Because that's what tinydb does in App Inventor. But when you're dealing with an actual database, the way you insert a row and the way you update a row are different. There are two different queries. One is called an insert query, for those of you who know SQL. The other one is called an update query. So they're different queries. You cannot mix up the two. So when lookup K returns a null, that means it is not found. Okay, this is not in the database. In that case, I'm going to create a content values object. A content values object is basically a key value pair. It's a map. Okay, so it's basically the same thing as a map, mapping a key to a value, but you can have any number of pairs. So you can have any number of key value pairs within, in this case, the KV object. And the way you insert items into a content values, yeah?
Where did the lookup come from?
Lookup is a method that
you
is
wrote it.
defined up here. Yep.
Okay.
So KV put is the method so that you can associate, a key. In this case, the key is K. The string K itself is the key. And then the value, which is the parameter K, is the value of this particular pair. So I'm associating, K, uppercase K, with the actual key that is being passed to me as a parameter. And then the next line is associating the letter V with the actual value that is passed to me. So these two are needed in order to call the insert call. Because when you use SQL insert, it needs to know what value is going to which column of a table. And that's how I associate the value corresponding to a table, corresponding to a column of the table.
So what is dot put?
Dot put, it's actually adding this particular pair to the key value pair map.
And is that like it's like a type of list or something? Or?
It's kind of like a list. If you know PHP, this is kind of saying kv open bracket k equals the parameter k. Can you read the comments? So it's kind of doing that in PHP, because in PHP you can have an associative list or associative map, and that's basically what it's doing. So KV is basically a map, or known as a hash in Perl. Same concept, except you have to use the methods to get it done. Is that okay?
So key has a like map and value has a map.
That's correct.
Maps within maps.
Yep. So so when we call the insert method of the database, you have to supply three things. The first one you supply is the name of the table, and then the second thing you supply, I cannot remember what it was. I cannot remember what the second parameter was, but it's not needed in this case. And then the last parameter that we need is to specify, okay, so we're inserting a row, but with every single row it has got names of the columns and also values to go into those columns. So the map, the KV map itself, is basically specifying what is the column name and what goes into that column of the new row. Is that okay? So for the column K, I want to put in the value of parameter K. For the column V, I want to put in the value of parameter V. Is that okay? All right, okay. So that's for inserting. The else case is corresponding to what if lookup is returning a non-null value, which means this particular key already has an entry in the database. In that case, I need to do an update. So when you do an update or when you do a query, you have to specify what column is going to be used to narrow down as a filter to say, okay, which rows are affected by this update. So the way you specify that, you can do it in two ways. You can basically just spell out what is K, so you can say K equals n, the string, and then use the concatenation, and then add lowercase k as the value. You can do it that way if you want to. Let me just show you exactly what I mean by that. Okay. So instead of these two lines, you can also do just this. Key, column, or filter. You can say k equals 2, and then plus, k like that. You can do it this way. So in other words, you're spelling out the entire criterion for the filter without using the question mark. Now, the use of the question mark, so let me comment out this, which is not a good approach. The question mark is used in conjunction with the next thing. The next thing is it's basically a list of strings. So these things are parameters to populate the question marks in the first one. Is that okay or not? So you can, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, it'll probably make sense when I see how that's being used with the query down below. Okay.
So the most general form of a key column, or to specify something like this, you can have an and you can specify v equals something. Then over here you have to supply two things. Okay, because the first thing goes into the first question mark, and then the second thing goes into the second question mark. Okay, but why do we have to go through this trouble if we can just do it without using this particular mechanism? It has to do with security and SQL injection. Okay, does someone want to kind of elaborate on that? What is SQL injection, which is one of the most common way of hacking into a database hosted on the web?
It's a string that when it runs through a parser executes SQL.
Right, but it has to do with a flaw in the script itself, right? The web script itself has a flaw. What kind of flaw is going to be? Will open up injection exploits. How do you make a query inside the script? Inside the web script, in PHP or Python, doesn't matter what language you're using, it has to do with the approach itself. Okay, so I can give you an example. I'm going to use a mouse pad here, so it's easier for me to write and easier to capture. Okay, there we go, mouse pad. Okay, so you can basically say in SQL, PHP, you can say query string equals to select, okay, right? ABC, and then you want to concatenate. I know how do you do concatenation in PHP? It's not a.
It's dot.
It's a single dot. Okay, so you say select blah 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 from.
Or it might be plus. I don't know. Check it. JavaScript.
I think it's a dot. Same as
JavaScript
Perl.
is a plus.
Okay.
Yeah, JavaScript borrowed that from Java because Java uses a plus for concatenation. PHP and Perl are kind of frenemies, so they copy from each other, and both use dots for concatenation. So then you can just do all kinds of concatenation, and then at some point you will concatenate with you probably want to specify exactly the columns that it's from. Okay, so you want to say yada column. Okay, and then you say where. Now this is where things can go wrong because you usually know which column is responsible for the filter. So you can say where column blah equals to, and then you provide the literal string and whatnot. So at some point you're going to concatenate it with a parameter that is passed from the URL itself. Okay, so you can say that this is URL param1. Okay, and then you have more concatenation stuff after that. Okay, so the thing is, what do you know about URL param1? You're assuming it is just something that is simple, right? What if it's not? What if it includes quotes? And it can basically extend your query.
Yeah. You can
Yep.
have an internal a second query inside of the query.
Yep.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And you can, because this is inside the where clause of SQL, you can basically specify a or true. What is that going to do if you specify yada yada or true? Which rows is it going to retrieve? All of them. So now if your web script is reading the result of the select query row by row and then format it and then present it on the screen, that particular URL request is going to see the entire database and not just one single row. That is SQL injection. Because basically what you do is you format your URL param so that it makes it much longer. Okay, so in this case you probably want to supply a open quote here, and then whatever is ending it is ending with another quote. Backslash quote is escape quote. Okay, I think that works in PHP too because that's kind of universal for escaping something. But what if the URL param itself has stuff like that too, to basically make it match on both ends, but still be able to retrieve everything that needs to be retrieved.
You think it's a bit of a backslash too?
Yeah. So inside a query, okay.
You could start it in that one with the quote too.
Exactly.
It would cancel those out immediately.
Yep. So the URL param, one can be formatted to any string because you can specify any string as a part of a URL parameter through the escapes, right? You can use is it %? Then you can specify the ASCII code, so you can express any character you want. So param1 itself can be something that has a quote, and then the or, and then the true, and then another or, and then something else, to basically match the other quote. So because of the or true as a part of the query, now the query is going to retrieve every single row out of this table. That can be bad. I haven't tried this on websites that are not my own. But it's a very common mistake, especially right after the dot boom back in 2000, okay? Because apparently some of the PHP books, for instance, PHP for Dummies, or the Idiot's Guide to PHP Programming, or PHP Programming in 21 hours, or something along that line.
Or how to get PHP hacked by building a website.
Right.
Yeah.
And then people will actually read that and copy the code from the CD-ROM to actual commercial websites. So hackers know that too. So hackers will read those textbooks, not textbooks, but the books on PHP, and find out that, oh, this is bad coding. But they will bet on people copying that code, right? So they know what kind of injection methods will likely to work on websites. You can also go to, Stack Overflow did not exist at the time, okay? But if you go to websites or forums where people ask questions like, okay, how do I integrate a parameter into a SQL query? And you look up the most frequently accessed answers, and you look at that and go like, nope, this one has got a security flaw. You can bet that many websites would integrate it too, because it is most looked up, right? So hackers use all of these techniques to find out, how to prioritize their attack techniques, because the most common methods are probably the ones you want to attack first.
And that whole thing can be scripted now, right? Python can script the entire interaction.
You can, but you can still, I think even in Python, you can still specify a query string just like this. Okay, so we are trying to move away from doing something like that by parameterizing the query. So instead of doing something like this, you will do something like this instead. So your query string is going to be this. Oops, end quote. And then when you supply the query string, you supply a second array to the call to whatever database you're accessing. So all the elements of the second array will be used to populate the question marks. But that's being done in the PHP library, which is not just concatenating the strings. So anything that has quotes, they will escape those quotes first. So even if the injection, even if the URL is still the same, the same as the one with the injection, but instead of actually extending the query itself, it's the question mark that will contain the quoted double quotes. So the query will just fail instead of being changed to the other form that we do not like. Do you see what I mean?
Kind of, but how are you getting a question mark? What's the question mark? I don't understand the question mark syntax.
Okay, so this would still be the string for the query, okay? But when you actually do the query, okay, I'm just imagining this as MySQL query. So what you do is you specify the query string, right? But then you also have to supply an array of params, okay? So the first element of array of params will be used to populate the first question mark. If you have another one, like column 2 equals to another question mark, then the second element of array of params is going to populate the second question mark. Okay. But the populating of the question mark is going to be escaped. So any questionable characters like quotes, like commas and stuff like that will be escaped to become actually a part of the search criterion, instead of extending the query itself. So of course I got the syntax wrong here. This is and. There we go.
When you say escape, it will treat it like a question mark instead of treating it as part of the command.
So let's say, the first element of array of params, is actually the quote character, and then something, and then another, actual quote character. They will be escaped before they get into the question mark place.
So they will be treated like text.
Yes.
Instead of like a part of the query.
Exactly. So that's why it is safe, because if you use this method, then SQL injection approaches do not work anymore. Instead of using your own concatenation, let the call to MySQL query to populate those parameters for you.
What about like the or true?
You can specify or true, but then or true becomes a part of what you're looking for in column blob. So if quote or true quote is not actually the value of one of the rows of that particular column, this query will just fail.
I see, because you can't get outside the quote.
Exactly. Yep. So the idea is everything in here is going to be escaped before it populates the question marks in the query. So this is a common, this is a really important thing when you're writing web scripts, is to utilize, this mechanism instead of, formatting your own string from the parameters that is passed in through the URL request. Not really sure whether we teach this in our own web scripting classes here, but this is the way to do it.
In the PHP class, she used like HTML entities to do that similar kind of thing.
Okay.
For MySQL queries, doing get strings.
But do you use a question mark in the query and then leave it up to the tool to populate it using the escaped version of those things?
No.
So you're still
You just store it
concatenating?
into the database as escaped HTML and then pull it back out and decode it.
Okay. So it will still be escaped. Okay. As long as it's escaped, it will still be okay. But this is the best way to do it. All right. So getting back here. So basically, getting back here, this list or this array of strings is used to populate the question marks. So in other words, the number of elements in key args should match the number of question marks in key column. Is that okay? Any questions about this? Okay. And then we have a new content values, because we still want to do one single update of a particular column of one particular row. So you have to specify which column is going to be updated to what value of that row. And then we just go ahead and call the update method of my Sqlite database, and that will perform all the updates for you. Are we doing okay so far with this? Yep.
The content value, you're making a new object. Is a new object with content value.
You mean on line 66?
Yeah.
So a content values is basically the same thing as a hash in Perl or a map in PHP. In other words, what we are doing here is we are, in PHP, it is similar to saying new v bracket v close bracket equals to v. And that is used over here so that you can specify what you're updating, how you're updating those particular rows. So for all the rows that are affected by this query, we are updating the column v, uppercase V, with the value of parameter v.
I've actually never seen that in PHP before. It looks like an array, but
I think this is PHP syntax called a map.
Associative array.
Associative array, yeah.
Maybe like object-oriented PHP or something?
There's no
No,
object.
no, it should be. So look at PHP associate. Okay, that's a regular array, indexed array.
Oh, that's an indexed array, huh?
No, that's not it.
Those are numeric.
Yeah, those are numeric. I'm looking for the one where,
There you go.
yeah, there you go. Single quote instead of double quote, sorry. And most scripting languages have something like this. Perl called it a hash with a % symbol. PHP call it an associative array, and then Python probably has a different name for that. But it's basically the same thing. You're just storing. You're specifying a key, and then you specify the value associated with the key. That's it. Is that okay? In Java, they also have a construct called map, which is the same thing too.
And Java uses an associative array.
Map is different.
It's a function that iterates over the array and applies the function to every element. So it maps. Creates another element that.
I'm mistaking the map to the standard template library map of C++.
STCL, yeah, that's.
Yeah, that's map, which is also a glorified version of a set. Because a set has no value associated, but it has all the same mechanism because you can only store one key once in that thing. And you can check whether it's there or not. Okay, so this is how we store. Any questions about the store method? You have to check whether it exists or not in the first place. If it does not exist, then you want to use an insert. If you want to update because it already exists, then you want to do an update. So the key is whether you want to go for an insert or an update. The rest is really just for setting up that particular call.
So the key column you have there, that's really a full SQ query, right?
Which one?
The key column?
The key column. It is actually a full. This is what feeds into the where part of a query. So you can make a conjunction, disjunction. You can make it as complicated as you want with with question marks marking the places where they are supposed to be substituted by values from the string array. So that's basically what it is. So in this case, we only got one single key column. So that's why I just called it the key column.
I see. So it says where it's formatted as the SQL where clause.
Yep.
And it includes the where itself.
Does not include the where, I think.
It says excluding the where itself.
Except excluding, right? Exactly.
Yeah, I got it. I see it.
Yep. So after everything is all done, this is basically the same thing as update table. The table name itself is KV. Oops, KV. You want to specify which column. Okay, so you specify the column which is V equals to the parameter V. So I'm going to borrow the syntax from PHP here because in PHP you can embed the value of a variable inside a string where key K equals to $K. So it's basically equivalent to this, oops, come on, K, quote. So it's basically equivalent to this in PHP. Okay, are there any questions about this part? Because I want to give you as many ways to represent this as possible so that people with some experience with PHP scripting can understand how this is done. Okay, well, okay, I take it back because you need to have quotes around the parameters. I think with SQL you have to use single quotes, not double quotes. You can't be wrong. Here we go. Something to that effect in PHP. Is that okay? What if you say, I don't want to use these methods. Just give me a way to execute SQL. Fine, go ahead and do it. So if you think you want to format your own query because you know a lot, you know your queries and this is easier, just go ahead and specify your entire query over here. It works just as well. So you can do it either way. You can make your own query and execute it, or you can use the method, which I think is a better way to do it because one, you don't have to remember this full syntax of SQL, and the second thing is you automatically have a benefit of getting rid of injection SQL injection attacks. So that's I just.
But if you're not parsing in URL or any user contributed data, you don't have to worry about it. If there's no way that it's user contributed.
But remember, you're storing something about your program, so at some point it probably connects to some user input.
Yeah, fair enough.
Well, there's a pretty good chance that at some point it connects to something that the user can input.
But couldn't you also filter the user input? Take out quotes, take out.
Yep, you can do that, but then you have to. But then you are now responsible to make sure that you filter out everything that can possibly lead to a problem, right? Whereas this is already done, and chances are Android is doing an okay job with the filtering.
So you're saying if you use SQL, you use a different DB command, you use execute command?
Yeah, you just use a exec SQL, then you can execute your own SQL statements any way you want, which is the way we created the tables to begin with. So when we create a table, we are just using exec SQL. So now you can basically just apply everything that you want to specify here. Yep.
And I'll be able to store an image and an audio file in the database, or is that?
Well, it can handle up to 140 something terabytes. The question is the efficiency, whether it is efficient to do it or not. I don't know for sure. So once you have the buffer and say, okay, these are the several thousands of what they call samples that you want to store, you can potentially just put the whole thing. Well, if you can serialize something into text, you can store it. I'm not sure about binary.
You're not sure if it does binary.
I don't think it can do with blobs, which is a binary object. So we can look it up a little bit.
I'll check it out.
Yeah, my Sqlite binary. Okay, there we go. Data types in Sqlite. So we got, they got blob. Yep. There you go. So, yeah.
Would you have to specify blob, or would it try and figure it out?
Well, it would try to figure it out because the way it figures it out is by affinity. So it would look at what you pass to it, and then it would try to figure out, okay, should I store this as text? Should I store this as integer, which is preferred? Or should I store it as a date, or should I store it as something? So you have to look at the affinity of types. Okay, so when we get to type affinity, so each column is assigned one of the following types. I thought it doesn't have a type associated with each column, but
it figures it out.
It figures it out, yep. But how do you specify a blob? A column with affinity blob does not prefer one storage class over another, and no attempt is made to coerce data from one storage class to another. But when you create a table, I don't even see how you can specify the type of a column. Okay.
Oh, it says right there. Go back up. It said if the declared type for a column contains a string blob, then the column has the affinity blob.
You mean here?
Yeah.
If the declared type for a column contains the string blob.
So you can suggest that it
Yep.
has an affinity of blob.
Yep. So affinity is just what the name implies. It is not definite. Otherwise, it would have just been definitely, okay, this column can only contain blobs. This column can only contain text. Instead, it is an affinity, which is basically saying, I prefer to look at things as, but if it is something that cannot be represented as blah blah, then I will just go ahead and change the type to fit what is given to me.
And can blob store any binary, like picture?
Right, a blob can be anything. The blob is basically just, blob means no data type is specified. So example type name from create table or cast expression. So if you don't do anything, then it's automatically a blob. If you do specify one of these things, it will be stored as an integer. If you specify these, it will be stored as text. If you don't specify anything, it is a blob. That's what it says, but I looked up the create table query from Sqlite, and from the syntax, I cannot find out how to specify the type of a column.
During the create table, you give the object.
Sorry?
Looking on that, like in 3.3, it shows it. Or you're looking in Sqlite.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the syntax of create. So you have create table, and then you have to provide the schema name, which is optional, table name, and then after open parentheses, you have to specify column definitions, and that can repeat. And then you can specify a whole bunch of table constraints, close parent, and that's it. So when you look up column definition, this is column definition.
Type name.
Oh, okay. So there goes the type name. Okay, I got it. Okay. So the type name can be any name repeating itself, and they can specify the assigned number, which is probably a range. Okay, I missed that part. Dope.
So column name and then type name.
Yeah, column name and then the type name, but it's optional.
So if you put blob or you didn't put it there,
It has an affinity to blob.
But then once you put a string in it, it'll try to do it.
Then it will just store as a string. Yep. So this is late, type binding, which is kind of strange for a database, because most databases have a very strict type, specification. You cannot leave it as, well, whatever it is, right? You have to specify what type it is. Is it a text? How long is the text? If it's a number, what kind of integer? Is it a date stamp and time stamp and so on? But Sqlite allows a lot of flexibility when it comes to what type of data you're storing. Very interesting, very interesting. But I can tell you that this program does work with strings. Okay, so I think you can do it with numbers and blobs too, because the way the table is created is I do not specify a type for key. I do not specify a type for v as well. So it has a blob affinity. But when you provide a string or something that can be represented as a string, it will just use a string to represent it. Cool. All right. And also, because when we do the store, I explicitly force the value and also the key to be strings. So I think it will definitely go to strings as much as possible because of that. All right. Question?
It was a string array, but it's key args.
It's a string.
Array is key args, but it's a binary object.
What is a binary
They
object?
have parameters. The key args is a string array. Isn't that where isn't that, I guess, not my key args, I guess it would be my content values.
Right, but k is a parameter which is of string type.
Right, that one I understand is of string.
Right. That one has to be a string array. Cannot be anything else. And that's a constraint of the update method
Oh,
itself.
and so so it's in content values.
Yep.
That's where
Mhm.
that's where the blob would be. I see.
Right, so this one can be, I suppose, anything.
That could be a blob.
Yep. So, but how do you exactly specify a blob instead of a string when you use content values? So that depends on content values. Content values in Android.
You can put an X in front of a quoted string for a number, a series of numbers.
You can put an
Like X single quote 0500, single quote. That'll make it a blob. The value, I guess, is a hex number.
Is
It's
the
on
value
bottom. It's on paragraph 3.4 on the other one you were looking at. Yeah.
Sqlite?
Yeah. Just coming down a little bit further. 3.4.
3.4. There we go. Okay. Oh, you mean here?
Yeah. So they're putting them in as coded entities, I guess.
So it has to do with the prefix of X and then the quote. But what is that actually? What is it actually storing? Are they interpreted to be like 05 is 1 byte, 00 is 1 byte? Or each one is a particular byte? Okay, so it has to do with the values. Okay, I know what to look. Sqlite, blob, specification, syntax. Okay, that should find something. Query expression. There we go. So with expressions. Sorry?
Yeah, I think they're bytes.
They're bytes?
I think so.
Are they in octal then? Because it doesn't take 4 digits to specify 1 byte. If it's octal, it's going to be 4 digits because the first 0 is the octal prefix, and then the other 3 would be the actual octal number. But in the octal number, 500 needs more than 8 bits to represent. So that doesn't.
You don't normally have X for an octal, you have X for an X, right?
Usually start an octal with a 0.
Okay, so the.
It says that if you 0 blob, it gives you the blob consisting of n bytes of 0x00. I mean, that means hex 0, but I don't know that that's the interpretation of the string.
Okay, so here is blob literals are string literals containing hexadecimal data and preceded by a single x or uppercase or lowercase x character. So it is in hexadecimal. This is 1 byte, this is another byte, this is another byte, another byte, another byte, another byte. So a literal value can also be the token null. Okay, so let's look up some more into blobs. I think it can be useful because the database is quite capable of storing a really huge amount of data, including what you need to store, like buffer for the audio channel. I'm just looking through this text here to find out. Oh, we're going back to the beginning, I think. Okay. Numerical. And blob is only here. This is the only paragraph to specify what a blob has. So when you store something, with the audio, slices or the audio samples, so you need to find out, what format you want to store it in, because you can I suppose you can encode it into MP3 first, and then store the MP3 stream itself as a blob in the database. But whatever you decide, you have to encode the entire thing into X, and then open single quote, and then the hexadecimal digits, 2 for each byte, and then you spell out the entire thing. That seems to be the only way to specify a literal constant as a blob, so that you can store that into the database. Yep.
So that's assuming the stream is in an argument or a value?
Well, whatever blob you're storing can be of any type. It can be an image, can be an MP3 encoded stream, can be just raw samples from the audio channel. So however you want to store it is up to you. If you want compression, go for MP3. If you don't want compression and just make it simple, you can go for raw samples. But regardless of what you want, the format of your choice, you have to store it as a blob.
But I mean, are you normally referencing an image or a music sample? It's not, or you have an object that's holding the data accurately?
You're looking at the raw data behind the object, because you cannot store an entire object unless you can serialize the object and then deserialize it and recreate the object. And many objects can do that. There's a serialized method, so that it actually it comes back as a string, and then there's a deserialized call to recreate the object itself. Yep.
I'm not sure if he was really asking this, but would it make more sense in most cases just to have the image or the MP3 stored and access it in other ways rather than putting it into a blob into a database?
Yeah, like should I store it in a file with a key name and then just put the file name inside?
You can do
the
that
database?
because that's a Java thing. It has nothing to do with Android itself. It's just your Java. How do you open the file for writing and how do you close it? That's like simple stuff, right? So you can do it that way too, but the downside of doing it that way is you can potentially end up with an inconsistency between the files that you have stored as opposed to the file that you think you have stored in the database. There can potentially be a disconnect between those two. And when you have a disconnect, then you have a big problem, because how do you figure out what the discrepancy is in that case? So if you can, this is just from my perspective, if I can, I would store everything as a blob so that it is consistent. I just need a database to do it. I don't need additional files to deal with it.
But
Yep.
when you recover that image, when you call it back to the database,
Mm-hmm.
you need to put it into an object in order to handle it in Java or Android, right?
That is correct.
Okay.
But in most libraries, they have several ways for you to populate an image object. So you just have to say, okay, what is this encoded in? Is this a PNG? Okay, should I interpret this entire array of bytes as a PNG object, or should I interpret it as a GIF, or should I interpret it as a JPEG? And the code would just take that byte stream as if it is reading it from a file, and then recreate the actual pixel-based or raster image.
So as long as the library object, you tell it what type it is, it's
Yep.
just going to read it as if it's from a file. It's just a stream of text,
Yep.
bits.
Yep, exactly. So as long as you're self-consistent and you say, okay, whenever I store audio, it's going to be MP3 encoded. When you retrieve it from the database, you just say, okay, now I have to decode it back into the samples, or I just feed the entire thing to the player.
You have to freeze dry it and then rehydrate it.
Yes. But as long as you know how you store it, you know how to unpackage it, that's fine. So that's your option. Do you want to MP3 encode it first, or do you want to just store the raw samples in audio? That's entirely up to you.
One's a pig of memory though.
Hmm?
The raw is a pig if I run a sample rate.
Well, 20 seconds is not too bad,
20
especially
seconds
if you change the sampling frequency to like 8 kilohertz, which is what you need for just talking and stuff like that. It's not too bad. I mean, 8 kilohertz and even 16-bit samples for each sample is not too bad. You can also go for
16,000 samples. 8 kilohertz is what? 8,000 samples a second times
Right.
16 bits wide. Is that what you
16-bit
get?
is 2 bytes, right? So each second is 1,600 bytes, right? 16K for each second, multiplied it by 20. It's manageable. But there are also all kinds of encoding schemes too, depending on what the intention was. If it's speech-based, if you look at the telco compression algorithms for phones and stuff like that, they have some really super high compression ratio type of thing for voice transmission.
Gotta fit it in those 53 byte packets. Asynchronous transfer mode.
Yep, and they're smart too. They're very adaptive. If you're not talking, they're not encoding anything. Silence is not encoded. It's just, well, it is encoded, but there's no data associated with silence.
So, side question. So inside memory, I could build an image and then load it into. I could create an image based on my memory composition of what I considered an image, and as
Right.
long as it's properly formatted PNG or JPEG or whatever, it would
Mhm.
render.
Right. So now the
I could
question
create an
is,
image with a computer. Create an image with the computer and just scribble in memory,
yes,
legitly.
yes.
That would be interesting. Screensaver.
Yeah, it's a matter of looking up the library of all the classes and find out which class is doing what you want to do.
No
So,
file format.
and that's why when I do Android programming, I tend to have like 20, 30, or even more tabs open, because that's basically what you're doing, is you're just fishing for the right class to get a job done. You had a question earlier?
No.
Okay. Yeah, but the possibility of storing a blob opens up everything, because anything you can store as a file, you can store as a blob now. Because Java provides a class where a stream is not associated with a file. A stream is associated with a byte sequence. So now you can just write whatever you want to write to that stream and close the stream, and then now you have a byte sequence. representing quote unquote a file, you just now need to convert that byte stream into hexadecimal representation, format it, and then make the query, store that into your SQLite, and you're done. You got your blob.
Okay, so I didn't understand the conversion from the string to the hexadecimal.
You can do it yourself, or you can do it,
If you get a handle to memory, you just scribble out the bytes and hex representation.
Yep, or once you have a stream, you can do it too.
Oh, I see. So what you're saying is when it comes to the memory, it's going to come in bit format, you're going to convert it to hex.
Right. So output stream in Java is a class, and the methods that you get here would include bytes. So when it's writing, or when, let me see, you want to do a right. So you have to look at the subclasses of an output stream, and there's a byte array output stream, which is probably what you want. So the byte array output stream works the same way as a normal output stream, where you save to a file and whatnot, except it's not being saved to a file. It is being saved to a byte array. Is that okay? And I would not be surprised if it already has a hexadecimal conversion member to convert it to a string, where it is in hexadecimal. Okay, toString converts the bytes, the buffer's content, into a string, decoding bytes using the platform's default character set. Okay, so let's find out what exactly is that character set. The method always replaces malformed input and unmappable character sequences with a default replacement string for the platform's default character set. So that may not be what you want. May not be a toString, because that's a string to string kind of conversion. It's not a binary to string conversion. But I'm just going through this to see if there's a quick and easy way to do it. If there's no way to do it, you can always just grab the byte array itself and do the conversion yourself. Because once you have the byte array, you just need to find out, okay, how long is the array, and then for each byte, look at the byte itself, convert it into the hexadecimal digits, just spew it off to a string, and just keep concatenating to the string. Okay, I can give you some basic code to do this. The syntax is probably going to be off, but it's going to be pretty close to what you need to do. So you basically assume that you have a byte array in Java, which is going to be coming from, okay, this is a byte array, which is coming from some kind of byte output stream to byte array. Okay, so byte output stream dot to byte array, like that. Okay, so the stream itself is BOS, which is byte output stream, and that's basically what you wrote to, as if it's a normal stream, a normal file. Okay, that's so for you, you're writing your audio channel, data, and you may be storing something else. Okay, so once you have the byte array, then you have an index I. So we have I equal to 0, while I is less than BA dot. Is it length for an array, or is it size?
Length.
Length. Okay, there we go. And then plus plus I at the very end, and then for each character, you just have to concatenate it to a string. So you have a string, which is the hex encoded version. Okay, it started off as a null string, got nothing in it to begin with. And then for each character, what you do is you say, hex encoded is going to be hex encoded plus, okay, I take it back. I lied, because you have to start with this. And then you have to end with hex encoded equals hex encoded dot, just the end quote. Okay, so in between, now you just have to do all the conversions. So the conversion can be done because you're dealing with byte bracket I, right? So you have to focus on the most significant byte, the most significant nibble first. So you basically do there are several ways to do it. the most surefire way to do it is to do a bitwise AND with F0 first. So you're clearing out the least significant 4 bits, and then you shift it by 4 bits to that side, and then you just add. Oh, you have to convert it to a hexadecimal digit. Okay, write another subroutine to do it. Okay, so you have to specify char to hex digit and int value. Okay, so this one is responsible to convert V, which has to be a value from 0 to 15, into a hexadecimal digit. So you have only 2 cases to deal with. If V is greater than or equal to 0 and V is less than 10, then you use a numerical digit. So, okay. Open, close. And your return value, or the result, is going to be a character here. So in this case, result is going to be V plus the ASCII code of 0. Not sure whether you can do this in Java. So in Java, you might need to cast a few things because Java is more picky about types than C++. But the idea is you look up the ASCII code of 0, you add V to the ASCII code of 0, then it becomes the ASCII code of the digit that you want. Okay. On the other hand, else if V is greater than or equal to 10 and V is less than 16, which is the most you can do for each hexadecimal digit, then the result is V minus 10 first, because you have to offset it, and then you add the ASCII code of A, so it becomes A, B, C, D, E, F. And then just return result. That's one single character. So with that, you can now just concatenate that over here. So you say to hex digit. Oh, how did I name it? Yep, to hex digit. This is the most significant nibble, and then you deal with the least significant nibble, which is going to be byte bracket I ampersand 0f. So that clears away the most significant nibble, only left with the least significant nibble. That should be it. So if you, so I'm giving you the general idea. The syntax may be off, because Java has different type checking convention compared to C and C++. But the general idea is this. Okay, you just take each byte out of your byte array, you convert each byte into the character, 2 characters representing the content of that byte. You just keep concatenating until you're done with the entire array of bytes.
Or we could just base 64 encode it, unbase it.
But it depends on. But the Sqlite method may not take the base 64 encoding scheme.
Oh, that's not a string.
Isn't that a string?
I'm not, because you're working with a query, right? So the way you supply the update or the insert, you're limited by what it can do with that insert statement. Okay, so you look up Sql.
Yeah, it'll become a string.
Hmm?
It'll become a string. So after
What will
that, it
become a
doesn't know
string?
what it is. The base 64 encoding. It's a string of a binary representation.
But then it's not as compressed as a real blob.
Yeah, I think it uses the.
So you just need a string. You don't even need a blob then.
It's probably more compressed than this one representation because you're using.
But this one is only to specify what you're storing. When it's stored, it is binary.
Yeah, but it's still longer. So, I mean, you're only
No,
using
it's not
you're
gonna
using
be
a
longer.
nibble, but you've wasted. You've got.
But that's only when you're.
16 representations out of 256.
But not when it's stored. So okay, so I see what your question is.
Well, it's going to be stored. It'll be stored as a as a blob.
It's
Yeah, the
going to be
string
stored
is
as
gonna
a
be
blob.
long.
Exactly.
The string will be
So the
long.
query is longer, but after the query is all processed, when you look at the actual DB file, the internal representation is completely just binary. So that's going to be as compressed as it possibly can.
Yeah, I'm just saying to get in and out, there's a string, there's a method to turn it into base 64.
But
and to take it out of base 64. So we can move it in and out of a string.
Okay.
Without having to go through the effort of moving it in and out of a string. Using base 64.
But it depends on whether the insert statement of Sqlite can decode base 64 or not.
No, it's just a string. We just have to run it through our own decoder. You just created an encoder, right?
Yeah.
So you would have to create a decoder.
No, the decoder is already in Sqlite.
Well, once I pull it up as a blob, it's going to come out as a string. I'm going to have to take it out of that string and put it into a...
That's a good question. When you pull it out of the blob,
Oh, I guess we didn't check
what
that
is it
out.
going to be, right?
It might be binary then.
Okay, so this is the insert statement. So when you specify the insert statement, you have to specify the value, and then the value
Oh,
is pulling expression, but the expression is X quote and then the hexadecimal representation. So Sqlite itself doesn't understand base 64. That's the problem.
I see the error of my thinking.
Not necessarily an error. It's you're just forgetting that you have to deal with what Sqlite itself understands.
Yeah, I converted my mind to storing it as a string.
Yeah, you can do that.
And it was really in my mind a blob.
Right.
In base 64, I could just move it in and out.
Yep.
So what's the difference between using the blob and using a string? Because you just created a string of text.
A string takes up more space. Even in base 64 format is still going to take up like what 25% more space than
Yeah,
these.
he's only got 16 values and he's using 8 bits. So he wasted 240 representations by carrying a hex value in a string.
So when the blob is put into memory, it's going to get rid of the string entirely and just store it back in binary.
When it's being stored in the file, it is only in binary. Okay, so let's use an actual example. So let's just say that you want to store.
Why not allow it just have binary string? Why go to the effort of why
Encode it into ASCII
why
first?
do we have to encode it to ASCII? And
Because
then
it has to do with the queries are all text-based. You cannot specify binary content
I see.
when the query language itself is text-based.
Yeah, but you're not. That's a data. That's a piece of data. You don't specify the.
But that piece of data that you're storing, which is binary, you cannot type it on the
You
command
can't
line.
reference it.
Okay, so let's say you're inserting something that's a blob. So your statement is going to be insert. Okay, let me use a mouse pad here so I can look at both the syntax and my statement at the same time. Okay, so there we go. So you're basically saying you have an insert statement. So you say insert into whatever table name. And then you have to specify column names and then specify the values. Okay, so you say, okay, so let's say you're only dealing with one column. So you say, column 1, and then values, and then you have to specify what goes into that row, right? But this is text. I cannot specify binary content unless I encode it in some way. Do you see the problem?
Okay.
So if I want to store some really kind of weird content, with the bytes, 0xFF, 0x, 2e, 0x00, which can be a very big problem because the null character is also known as the terminator of a C string. So a lot of times this is marking the end of something, but this is a byte sequence. This is a blob. So 00 is no more special than any other byte, the other 255 values for a byte. So let's say I have 5 bytes to store, okay, and the last one ends with an EF. Okay, these are the 5 bytes that I want to store. How do I specify these 5 bytes into the insert statement? So these 5 bytes are the actual content corresponding to column 1 of the row that I'm creating. That becomes a problem. So because the query itself is in text, so you have to be able to specify those 5 bytes in regular text. Okay, and the way to do this, according to what we have just read, is to use X quote as the prefix, and then you specify the individual bytes, like FF is 1 byte, 2E is 1 byte, 00 is 1 byte, 01 is 1 byte, EF is 1 byte, end quote to basically mark the end of that blob, and that's it. So the query itself is not efficient because I am using 1 byte for every 4 bits. So the density of data is very low. But this is transient. This string will be deallocated, go back into the heap, and collected when this query is no longer needed.
And that, you're saying, will be converted into actual binary.
Correct. So if the database is doing what I think it is doing, then these 5 bytes are not stored in that form in the database. It is stored in 5 actual bytes in the database, or somewhere close to 5 bytes, because you need to identify the length of the array as well. So it's going to be 5 bytes plus some counter for that array. So yes, the query itself is not efficient, but you don't have a way to get around it, because this is the only way to let Sqlite understand that I want to store 5 binary bytes into this row.
Are there any databases that let you reference so that you don't have to do the conversion?
Well, I know most databases have the concept of a blob, but if you want to specify the content of the blob, you still need a way to do the encoding. Now, some databases may understand base 64, which is a more efficient way of doing things, because with base 64, you're using 6 bits out of 8 to specify, okay, so for each character, you're representing 6 bits instead of only 4 bits. So base 64 encoding is 50% more efficient compared to just plain old, hexadecimal encoding, which is what I'm doing here. But the space that you're saving is transient, because it only has to do with the query that you're formatting. But once the string is passed and processed by Sqlite, that string has no value anymore, and as a result, it's going to be deallocated, and it's not continuing to chew up space in any way. It's not chewing up space in your memory. It's not chewing up space in your database. It's gone. So the inefficiency of the encoding is not a problem, unless you're really, really running out of memory. Is that making any sense? Okay.
There's a bind blob or something on Sqlite.
A what?
There's a bind blob.
How do you spell it?
BIND-BLOB.
Bind
blob.
Blob.
That's how they're throwing the binaries into the database.
Okay.
Something like that. So we saw the string example.
Mm-hmm.
But they're like, when I look at throwing an image in there, they bind it to a blob.
But that's a C interface. I'm not sure whether it is available to. That's also a C example.
And Sqlite Android.
So it depends on whether that interface is implemented or not. Android. There we go. Okay. It's how to store. Data type. So that means you don't have to encode it first. Okay, so let's look up bind. Given an array of string bind args, this method binds all of them into one single call. That's not what we want. Bind blob, bind a byte array to this statement. And the type we're looking at is Sqlite program. So it's a different class, a base class for compiled Sqlite programs. So this one is not a single query anymore. It is actually a program that you can run in Sqlite. But when you look up Sqlite statement or query, that if you can find bind in here, that will be useful. So bind, there's only one match. and there's no bind in this one. And if you look up SQLite query, I think that's all text-based, so bind probably is not here. There's only one reference to it. Yep.
What does the term bind mean?
Bind basically means you're associating two things. In other words, if you can, so ideally speaking, in the method insert, if we can have a way to say, okay, bind this byte array as if it is this argument, it'll be great, because now you don't have to do the conversion, because it's basically saying, okay, this thing is now associated with the value that we are inserting into the row. So binding is really just an association. Right. But it doesn't look like you can do it without using SQLite program, which is something I haven't really looked into it, but it looks kind of interesting from the efficiency perspective.
Is that something you run during the query, or is it a separate program?
You mean SQLite program?
Yeah.
I haven't really looked into it. It's a base class for compiled SQLite programs. So SQLite, like any SQL engine, you can actually develop code for it, and it can compile that, so that your statements are no longer spelled out like select blah blah blah. It will be in some kind of internal representation. So one, they execute faster, and two, they are more compact. But the problem is you cannot really read it because it is now compiled. It's not in text anymore.
Byte array.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how to apply this, but if we can use SQLite program in an SQLite database method, then we will probably have better efficiency.
Looks like there's something called a byte array buffer. Somebody solved the problem, so we can throw the string into the byte array buffer.
Yeah, you can have a byte buffer. A byte buffer was mentioned in the previous class with socket, because that's how you interact with the socket, is you provide a byte buffer for the socket to write to write from. You supply a byte buffer and say, okay, I want to write these bytes to the socket. So that's the first contact with a byte buffer itself. And the byte buffer is just what the name implies. It has a certain capacity, and you have a certain quote-unquote cursor. We are up to this point out of this much. So it can automatically maintain, okay, we're working through the buffer, and this is where we stopped last time. So it can continue from that point on, but it knows its own capacity and its limit as well. So it knows when to stop. But this, SQL program or SQLite program is interesting. That if we can get it to work, that might be the most efficient way to do it without having to convert everything into hexadecimal first, which is inefficient. But nonetheless, that can be done. So we have a way to do it. It's just may not be the most efficient way. Is that making any sense? So because you can specify, okay, first of all, you can specify your own SQLite query using exec SQL. So that opens up the gateway to use anything that you can express just by typing. And if you can use a SQLite query, then we know how to do the encoding from a internally binary thing, which is a byte array. We know how to encode it into the hexadecimal format. So we have a way to store binary things into SQLite already. It may not be the most efficient way because we have to do the conversion, but it is doable. So the next thing we can do is to look into SQLite program and see whether we can shortcut it and say, okay, can we do this without the conversion? That's something that we can improve on. Yep.
When you do the table create, does it create a file on the phone?
Yes.
It is.
Yep.
And it knows where to put it?
Hmm?
It knows where to put it?
It puts it into a folder that is specific to your app.
Yeah, okay.
So by setting, the way Android works is every app has its own user and group ID, and then all the files are by default marked to be unreadable by anyone with a different user ID or group ID. So your app, the data that you save, within your app, including the Sqlite database, is going to be private to the app itself. Other apps cannot access it unless the phone is rooted. Then root can access everything.
So it's basically using Linux.
Yep, exactly. But it has the added advantage of every app has its own user ID and group ID. So you can look at each app as its
new user every time.
exactly. Every app is its own user, and there's no cross-user read permission at all. The only exception to the rule are the media folders, and that's why sometimes an app can ask you, do you want to allow me to access your media folder, because those folders do not belong to a particular app, so the operating system gets to manage that and go like, okay, other apps can read these folders with the permission of the user. So it will prompt you and ask, do you permit this app to have access to your media folder? But if your app does not export that, does not specify that yes I would allow other apps to read my folders, then other apps should not be able to read it at all. But once your phone is rooted, then all bets are off.
Okay, so that's because you're acting as root.
Exactly. But even if your phone is rooted and you run an app that can run in rooted mode, it will still request you to say yes before it can go into the root permission mode.
Okay.
So it will still give the end user one last chance of saying, no, I don't want this app to access everything on my phone.
So you could make that app be a separate user, but if you say yes, you can make it.
Right. But if you make the assumption that a phone is not rooted, then the data is only readable by that particular app itself.
Okay.
Now, if somebody is to steal the device itself, then all bets are off as well. Because whoever is stealing the device has physical access to the device, can then decide to root the device. And once you root a device, you can install what we call a root file reader or file manager. Then everything is readable. So this does not protect the end user from a physical theft of the phone. It only prevents other apps from reading the data of this particular app. Yep. So we have to be very clear about how much protection is actually being offered in this case. Okay, so good discussion today.